The large wooden doors of the city's most prestigious concert hall were closed tight, keeping the noise of the busy streets outside. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old velvet, polished wood, and the expensive perfume of the wealthy people sitting in the velvet seats. This was the final night of the Regional Young Musicians Competition, an event that usually gathered the best talent from schools and conservatories across the country. It was a place where serious musicians came to launch their careers, a place filled with tension, ambition, and very high standards. The lighting in the hall was dim, creating a spotlight that shone brightly on the massive black grand piano sitting alone in the center of the stage. Around the piano, the atmosphere was heavy. This wasn't a casual talent show where people clapped just for trying. This was a competition judged by people who dedicated their entire lives to music. The audience was quiet, filled with critics, music teachers, and parents who had spent thousands of dollars on lessons for their own children. They were a tough crowd. They had heard it all before, and they were hard to impress. Sitting at a long table to the right of the stage were the three judges. In the middle was a man known for being extremely strict. He had white hair and a face that rarely showed any emotion. He had listened to hundreds of pianists in his career, and very few made him smile. On his left sat a woman with sharp glasses and a notebook that was already full of scribbles. She looked tired and bored, checking her watch as if she had somewhere better to be. On the right was a younger man, but he looked just as serious, tapping his pen nervously against the table. For the last 3 hours, they had listened to teenagers play difficult pieces. Some were good, some were bad, but none of them had been truly memorable. The judges were ready for the night to be over. The announcer, a man in a tuxedo, walked onto the stage. The murmur of the crowd died down. People stopped checking their phones and sat up straight. The announcer cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing through the large hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "for our final performer of the evening, we have a very unique situation." He paused, looking down at his paper with a confused expression, as if he wasn't sure if he was reading it correctly. "This competitor is the youngest we have ever had in the history of this competition. Please welcome an 8-year-old girl." A wave of shock went through the audience. It wasn't a happy shock. It was a confused one. People looked at each other, raising their eyebrows and whispering, 8 years old? An older man in the third row whispered loudly to his wife, "This is a joke, right? They are letting a child play now?" The wife shook her head, looking annoyed. "I paid good money for these tickets. I don't want to watch a child's recital. I want to hear real music." The judges did not look happy either. The man in the middle frowned deeply and whispered something to the woman next to him. She rolled her eyes and flipped her notebook to a fresh page, clearly expecting this to be a waste of time. In their minds, an 8-year-old had no business being on that stage. Music at this level required years of training, large hands to reach the keys, and a maturity that a child simply did not possess. They were preparing to sit through a cute but terrible performance. While the room filled with doubt and low whispers, the side door of the stage opened. A small figure walked out into the bright light. The girl was incredibly small. Under the harsh spotlight, she looked even tinier. She was wearing a simple dress with a ribbon in her hair, and her shiny black shoes made a soft clicking sound on the wooden floor. She walked toward the piano with careful steps, clutching a small piece of paper in her hand. It looked like she was walking into a giant's world. The piano was as big as a car to her. The bench looked like a throne she couldn't possibly climb. As she walked, the whispers grew louder. "Look at the size of her," someone laughed from the back. "She can't even reach the pedals." "They are just doing this for publicity," a woman hissed. "It's disrespectful to the other contestants." The crowd was not kind. They felt that the dignity of the competition was being lowered by letting a child participate. There was no applause as she walked. Only a thick, uncomfortable silence mixed with the sound of shuffling feet and quiet scoffing. But the girl did not look at the audience. She did not look at the judges or their angry faces. She kept her eyes fixed on the piano. There was a determined look on her small face, look that said she was there for a reason. When she finally reached the piano, the real struggle began. The bench was too high. She had to hop up slightly to sit on the edge. Once she was seated, Her feet dangled helplessly in the air, far away from the gold petals on the floor. It was a comical sight to the adults watching. To them, it was proof that she didn't belong. A pianist needed pedals to control the sound. She couldn't even reach them. The girl wiggled a bit, trying to get comfortable. She smoothed out her dress and adjusted the bench, trying to slide forward as much as she could without falling off. The silence in the room was unbearable. Every movement she made seemed loud. The judges were writing furiously already, likely marking down points for her size before she even played a note. Suddenly, the girl reached down to the side of the piano. She pulled out a large, thick book that was resting on the floor. It took both of her small hands to lift it. She placed it on the music stand. It was a book of complex classical music. The audience craned their necks to see what she was going to play. They expected to see a book of nursery rhymes or simple children's songs. But as the light caught the cover, those who were close enough gasped. It wasn't a book for children. It was a book of advanced compositions, full of black notes that were tightly packed together. It was the kind of music that gave college students nightmares. The man with the white beard stopped writing. He squinted at the stage, trying to see the music book. The woman with the glasses stopped tapping her pen. For the first time, there was a flicker of curiosity in their eyes. Surely, the girl wasn't going to play what was in that book. It had to be a prop. Or maybe she was just turning to the easiest page in the whole book. The girl sat very still. She took a deep breath, her small shoulders rising and falling. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment, closing her eyes. The audience watched, waiting for her to cry, to freeze up, or to run away. The pressure on that stage was immense, far more than any 8-year-old should have to handle. The judgment from 300 people was like a physical weight pushing down on her. But then, she opened her eyes. The fear that was there a moment ago was gone. Her face changed completely. She wasn't a shy little girl anymore. She looked focused, serious, and entirely in command. She lifted her right hand and placed it on the keys. Her fingers were short and thin, with small nails that looked like they were bitten down. Then she placed her left hand. The distance between the low notes and the high notes was too wide for her small hands to reach both at the same time. Yet she positioned them confidently. The hall went dead silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment they could prove to themselves that this was a mistake. The man in the gray suit crossed his arms, ready to shake his head. The judge in the middle picked up his pen, ready to write cute but unprepared. The girl hovered her hands over the keys for just a second. She didn't look at her hands, and she didn't look at the music sheet anymore. She stared straight ahead at the back wall of the hall, looking at something no one else could see. Without a moment of hesitation, she brought her hands down. The first sound that came out of the piano wasn't a clumsy child's note. It was a sharp, powerful chord that rang out like a gunshot. It was so loud and sudden that several people in the front row jumped in their seats. The sound was full and rich, shaking the dust in the rafters. The girl didn't stop there. Before the sound of the chord could fade away, her hands were moving again. She wasn't playing a simple melody. She was playing a rush of notes. A storm of sound that moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a human being, let alone a child with such small hands. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, dancing over the ivory and ebony keys like they were weightless. The audience's confusion vanished instantly. The whispers stopped. The judge's pen froze in midair, hovering over the paper. The woman with the glasses actually dropped her pen, her mouth falling open slightly. The man who had been ready to laugh was now leaning forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. The little girl who had looked like she didn't belong was attacking the piano with the strength of a lion. She didn't need the pedals to make the music sing. She was controlling the volume and intensity with her touch alone. The silence of judgment was replaced by a stunned, breathless awe. The jury, just seconds ago, ready to dismiss her, was now completely speechless. They leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away. The sound that filled the concert hall did not match the visual of the small girl sitting on the bench. It was a paradox that confused the brain. The eye saw a child who should have been playing with dolls or learning to ride a bicycle, but the ears heard a musician with the power and command of a seasoned master. The initial shock of the first chord had faded, but it was replaced by a new kind of tension. It was the feeling of witnessing something that defied logic. As her fingers continued to dance across the keys, the complexity of the music became undeniable. This was not a simple melody repeated over and over. The notes were tumbling out so fast that they seemed to blur together. It was a rapid-fire assault of sound, yet every single note was distinct and clear. She wasn't just hitting the keys. She was sculpting the sound. The tone she produced was warm and singing, a quality that pianists twice her age spend decades trying to achieve. Usually, children play with a percussive sound, hitting the notes like they are typing on a typewriter. But this girl was different. She was caressing the keys, digging her fingertips in to pull the emotion out of the strings vibrating inside the giant piano. The audience, which had been so full of rude whispers just moments before, was now paralyzed. Who had complained about wasting his money was now leaning forward so far that he was almost on the edge of his seat. His mouth was slightly open, and he had forgotten to blink. The annoyance had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of utter confusion. He couldn't understand how this was possible. The skepticism that hung over the room like a dark cloud was being blown away by the sheer force of the music. On the stage, the physical struggle was evident, which only made the performance more incredible. Because she was too small to reach the pedals, her legs were swinging freely beneath the bench. This was a huge disadvantage. The pedals are used to sustain notes and make the music sound connected. Without them, the music could have sounded dry and choppy. But she compensated with her hands. She used a technique where she held notes down with her pinky finger while her thumb jumped to play the next melody, creating a smooth connection that mimicked the use of the pedal. It was a workaround that required immense concentration and physical control. Her small hands had to stretch and twist in ways that looked uncomfortable, constantly moving up and down the keyboard to cover the distance an adult would easily span. The judges were now fully awake. The woman with the sharp glasses had stopped looking at her watch. She was staring at the girl's hands, her own fingers twitching slightly as if she were mentally trying to keep up with the music. She was a technical expert, and she knew exactly what was required to play this piece. She knew that the passage the girl was currently playing involved crossing the left hand over the right hand repeatedly, a maneuver that often led to tangled fingers and disastrous mistakes. But the girl navigated these crossings with the grace of a skater gliding on ice. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. It was flawless. The music shifted suddenly. A fast, chaotic storm of notes slowed down. It moved into a quieter, more melancholic section. The dynamic change was drastic. The girl didn't just play softer. She changed the entire atmosphere of the room. The sound became thin, fragile, and incredibly sad. It was the kind of music that makes you remember things you had tried to forget in this quiet moment. The vulnerability of the girl became the focal point. The spotlight caught the side of her face. She was sweating now. Tiny beads of perspiration glistened on her forehead. Her breathing was heavy and rhythmic, matching the phrases of the music. She was working incredibly hard. This wasn't a magic trick. This was pure physical exertion. She was fighting the instrument, fighting the size of her own body, to produce this beauty. Her bow was slipping slightly to the side of her head, but she didn't seem to notice or care. Her eyes were closed tight, shutting out the world, the judges, and the audience. She was inside the music, living in it. The old judge in the center, the one who had seen thousands of pianists, felt a lump form in his throat. Had heard this specific piece played by world-renowned virtuosos in grand concert halls all over Europe. They played it with precision, with cold perfection. But this girl, she played it with heart. It sounded raw. It sounded like she was telling a story that she was too young to have lived through, yet she understood it perfectly. The music wasn't just coming out of the piano. It was coming out of her. The realization hit him hard. Talent like this is not taught. It is not drilled into a child by strict parents or expensive teachers. This was a gift, something rare and natural that couldn't be explained by logic. The audience was no longer a crowd of separate individuals. They had merged into one collective entity, held together by the spell of the music. A young woman in the front row, who was a music student herself, felt tears welling up in her eyes. She wasn't crying because the music was sad. She was crying because she understood the difficulty of what she was seeing. She knew how many years she had practiced just to be mediocre, and here was this child, flying through a masterpiece that she herself struggled with. It was a humbling moment for everyone who had ever touched a piano. The girl's face, usually soft and round with the features of a child, looked fierce. Her jaw was set tight. She bit her lip as her fingers raced through a series of rapid octaves. Because her hands were so small, she had to snap her wrist to reach the notes. Using the momentum of her entire arm to strike the keys with enough force to be heard. It looked athletic, almost violent, but the sound that came out was beautiful and singing. It was a stark contrast between the effort and the result. To the untrained eye, she looked like she was fighting a battle, but to the musicians in the room, she was winning a war against the limitations of her own body. The silence in the hall was heavier than it had been all night. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of intense focus. You could feel the heartbeat of the room slowing down to match the tempo of the girls playing. The air conditioning hummed quietly, a background noise that had always been there, but was now the loudest thing in the room when the music paused for a split second. The girl approached a critical part of the piece. This was the section where the music built up to a massive, loud climax. It required power, speed, and absolute confidence. She lifted her hands high above her head, her tiny fingers stretching wide. The anticipation in the room was excruciating. The judges leaned in, the audience held their breath. It felt like the entire world was balanced on the edge of that piano bench. She brought her hands down with a force that seemed like it might hurt her, crashing into the low notes with a sound that shook the floorboards. The resulting boom was not just loud, it was authoritative. It silenced any remaining doubt in the hall. The girl didn't flinch. She didn't look scared. She rode the wave of sound, her body swaying back and forth, completely lost in the storm she had created. Her feet, dangling uselessly, kicked back and forth with the rhythm, a subconscious movement that reminded everyone watching that this musical giant was, in fact, just a little girl. It was a heartbreakingly beautiful sight, the small frame against the massive instrument, the child's feet kicking in the air, producing music that touched the soul. As the music rushed toward the midpoint of the performance, the intensity did not let up. If anything, it grew stronger. The girl showed no signs of tiring, although her arms must have been burning. Her fingers moved like independent creatures, possessing a will of their own. The notes were crisp, like pearls dropping onto a marble floor. The melody soared above the accompaniment, singing clearly and brightly. The music student in the front row stopped taking notes. She put her notebook away and just listened. Realized that she was witnessing a moment that she would talk about for the rest of her life. There are moments in history where the rules are broken, where the impossible becomes possible. This was one of those moments. The barrier of age, the barrier of size, the barrier of experience, all of it was being shattered by 8 small fingers on a row of black and white keys. The girl's expression remained serious, almost stern, throughout the difficult passages. There was no smiling, no waving to the crowd. She treated the piano with a respect that was far beyond her years. She knew that this was a serious moment. She knew that she had something to prove. And as the music swelled, filling every corner of the vast hall, it became clear that she wasn't just proving herself to the judges. She was proving that passion knows no age. She was showing the audience that art doesn't care how tall you are or how old you are. It only cares about the truth inside you. The judges looked at each other, but this time there was no eye rolling. There was no skepticism. The woman with the glasses had a single tear running down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. The man in the middle had his arms crossed, but his fingers were digging into his own sleeves, a sign of the emotion he was trying to suppress. They were witnessing a miracle, and they knew it. The tables had turned completely. The jury, who had sat down, expecting to As the initial shock of the opening moments began to settle, the true nature of the performance started to reveal itself. The music was not just loud and fast. It was a complex, woven tapestry of sound that seemed to have no end. The girl was playing a piece that was notoriously difficult, a composition designed to test the limits of human endurance and coordination. To the untrained ear, it was a beautiful storm. But to the musicians in the room, it was a high-wire act without a safety net. The melody she was playing required the left hand to play a fast, rhythmic pattern, while the right hand played a completely different rhythm on top of it. It was like patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time, but at 100 miles an hour. Most adults practice this specific section for months to get it smooth. The girl, however, played it as if she were breathing. Her hands moved in perfect synchronization, entirely independent of each other, creating a rich, layered sound that filled the entire hall. The physical disparity between the girl and the instrument became even more fascinating as the piece progressed, because her hands were so small. She couldn't stretch her fingers to reach some of the wide intervals that the composer had written. Normally, a pianist would simply reach their thumb and pinky out to cover the distance. But for her, that was impossible. She had developed a unique solution. When she needed to jump from a low note to a high note, she didn't stretch. She launched her hand through the air. It was a quick whipping motion. She would play a low bass note with her left hand, and in the split second that the sound was fading, her right hand would fly up the keyboard to land on the high note precisely when it was needed. It looked acrobatic. It looked like a small bird darting from branch to branch. Every time she made one of these jumps, the audience held its breath. There was a very real risk that she would miss the note, that her small finger would slip between the keys or hit the wrong one. But she never missed, not once. Her aim was perfect. It was a display of muscle memory and spatial awareness that was frighteningly advanced. It was as if she had mapped out the geography of the piano in her mind and knew exactly where every key was. Even without looking, the music suddenly shifted gears again. It moved from a stormy, chaotic section into a quiet, delicate interlude. This was a trap for many young players. They often think that playing fast is the hard part, but playing softly is much more difficult. Playing softly requires control. You have to hit the key gently enough to make a whisper of sound, but hard enough that the note doesn't disappear entirely. The girl adjusted her body language immediately. Her shoulders relaxed, and her movements became smaller. She caressed the keys now, barely touching them. The sound coming from the piano was so faint that the people in the very back rows had to lean forward to hear it. The hall became deadly quiet. The air conditioning seemed to hum louder than the music. It was a magical moment of intimacy in a huge public space. The silence was not empty. It was charged. It felt like the entire room was holding a collective breath, afraid that if someone coughed or shifted in their seat, the spell would be broken. In this quiet moment, the girl's face could be seen clearly. The harsh spotlight made her skin look pale, but her cheeks were flushed pink with exertion. A small strand of hair had come loose from her ribbon and was falling over her forehead. She didn't brush it away. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly to the right. She was listening. She wasn't just playing notes from a page. She was hearing the music in her head and guiding her fingers to match that internal sound. It was a look of deep, profound concentration. The kind of look usually seen on a scientist solving a complex problem or a painter putting the final brushstroke on a masterpiece. The judges were completely transfixed. The woman with the glasses had taken off her glasses and was rubbing the bridge of her nose, a sign of utter disbelief. The strict judge in the middle had abandoned his notebook entirely. He was staring at the girl's hands, his brow furrowed. He was trying to figure out how she was doing it. He knew the physics of the piano. He knew the weight of the keys. He knew that a child's fingers often lack the strength to play consistent trills, rapid alternations between two notes. Yet, there she was, executing a trill in the middle register that was as smooth and even as a sewing machine's needle. It was a technical impossibility, or so he had thought, till now. A young man in the audience, perhaps a student at the local conservatory, sat with his arms crossed. He had come to mock the show, expecting to laugh at a child. Now he felt a strange knot in his stomach. He recognized the piece. It was one he was struggling to learn himself. He had spent weeks working on the middle section, the very part the girl was playing now with such ease. He watched her left hand crossing over her right hand, a complicated maneuver that always tangled him up. She did it without even looking. Her hands wove in and out of each other like snakes, never colliding, never hesitating. He realized with a sinking feeling that this 8-year-old girl, who was half his size, played better than he ever would. It was a humbling, painful, yet awe-inspiring realization. He uncrossed his arms and sat back, defeated but captivated. The music began to build again. The quiet interlude was over. The girl's posture stiffened. She raised her hands slightly higher, preparing for the next onslaught. The rhythm changed. It became a waltz, but not a gentle dancing waltz. It was a heavy, ominous waltz, like a thundercloud rolling over the horizon. The bass notes began to thump like a heartbeat. Boom-dum-dum. The piano started to vibrate visibly. The sound was so deep that you could feel it in your chest. The girl was fighting the instrument now. The piano was resisting her, pushing back against her small hands with the weight of its heavy keys. But she refused to let it win. She leaned into the keyboard, putting the weight of her upper body behind the notes. Her feet kicked back and forth furiously, the only outlet for her intense energy. It was a David and Goliath battle, a tiny child pitted against a massive musical beast. And she was winning. She approached a series of massive, crashing chords. These were the moments that tested the performer's stamina. Hitting these chords required using the entire arm, not just the fingers. She lifted her arms high, her hands forming claws, and brought them down with precision. The sound was explosive, like a door slamming in an empty house. Clang. It was startling. But she didn't stop. She hit the next one. Clang. And the next. Each one was perfectly timed, perfectly voiced. She wasn't just hitting the keys. She was sculpting the sound, making the melody ring out clearly even through the thunderous accompaniment. The audience was no longer a crowd of separate individuals. They had become a single entity, united by the experience. A grandmother in the front row, who remembered hearing this piece on the radio 50 years ago, found herself weeping silently. She wasn't crying because the music was sad. She was crying because of the purity of it. In a world full of noise, arguments, and confusion, this moment was perfect. It was a moment of absolute clarity. The innocence of the girl combined with the complexity of the music created something profound. It was a reminder that beauty can come from the most unexpected places. The girl's face was set in a mask of fierce determination. There was no smile now. She was working too hard to smile. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple and fell onto the piano keys. She didn't wipe it away. Her arms were moving so fast that they were almost a blur. She was playing at a speed that seemed impossible for her small muscles to sustain. How long could she keep this up? The audience felt the tension building. They were exhausted just watching her. But she showed no sign of slowing down. Her reservoir of energy seemed endless. The music twisted and turned, taking unexpected paths. Just when you thought the melody was going one way, it would dart off in another direction, leading the listener on a chase. The girl knew every corner of this musical maze. She led the audience through dark tunnels and bright open fields, up mountains and down into valleys. She was in complete control. She was the captain of this ship, navigating through a storm that she had created herself. Near the end of this section, the music became incredibly intricate. There were notes flying everywhere, a whirlwind of sound. It was the kind of passage where one wrong finger placement could ruin the whole flow. The risk of disaster was high. The musicians in the room knew that a single mistake at this speed would be obvious to everyone. It would break the spell. The tension in the hall was unbearable. People were gripping the armrests of their chairs. The judges were leaning so far forward they looked like they might fall out of their seats. The girl's fingers moved with a life of their own. They were spider-like, scuttling across the keys with terrifying speed. She didn't look at her hands anymore. Her eyes were fixed on a point in the distance, seeing the music in her mind. She trusted her hands completely. She was in the zone, a state of being where time seems to slow down and actions become automatic. It was a state that elite athletes and master The heavy chord that the girl had struck was still vibrating in the air, fading slowly like an echo in a canyon. The hall was trapped in a bubble of absolute silence. Usually, when a difficult piece reaches a loud climax, the audience instinctively prepares to clap. They hear the end coming, and they get their hands ready. But this time, nobody moved. They could feel that the piece wasn't finished. The music had gone quiet, but the story wasn't over yet. It was like the calm in the eye of a hurricane, a moment of deceptive peace before the final storm. The girl sat very still, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She was breathing hard, her small chest rising and falling visibly under her dress. The physical effort of the previous minutes had taken a toll. Her arms must have felt like lead weights. Her forehead was damp with sweat, and a few loose strands of hair were plastered to her skin. But her face had changed. The fierce, intense look of the warrior was gone. In its place was a look of profound sadness. It was a soft, vulnerable expression that made her look even younger than 8 years old. She looked like a child who had suddenly remembered a painful memory. Without warning, her right hand moved. It didn't strike the keys. It caressed them. She began to play the slow movement of the piece. This was the part that separated the technicians from the artists. Anyone with enough practice could learn to play fast notes. It was just muscle memory and repetition. But playing slowly, with feeling, was a gift. It required a soul. The melody that emerged was heartbreaking. It was a simple, thin line of notes that sang out in the empty space of the hall. Because she was playing so softly, the natural acoustic of the room took over. The sounds seemed to drift up to the high ceiling and float there like smoke. The audience stopped breathing again. The contrast was shocking. One moment they were being battered by a storm of sound, and the next they were being lulled by a lullaby of sorrow. The judges were completely motionless. The older man in the middle, the one who had seen it all, felt a strange tightening in his chest. He knew this piece intimately. He had played it himself 40 years ago. He knew that the slow section was where most people failed. They played it too mechanically, focusing on the length of the notes rather than the emotion behind them. But this girl, she wasn't thinking about the timing. She was playing with a rubato style, technique where the player steals a little bit of time from one note and gives it to another to make the music breathe. It was a risk. If done poorly, the music would sound sloppy. But she did it perfectly. It sounded like a human voice speaking, hesitating and sighing. The girl's head bowed low. She was looking at her hands, but she wasn't seeing them. She was somewhere else entirely. The music had become a private conversation between her and the instrument. The audience felt like intruders, witnessing a moment of deep personal grief. It was a humbling experience. Here was a child, a being who had only been on this earth for 8 short years, expressing a depth of emotion that grown adults spent their whole lives trying to understand. Where had she learned this kind of sadness? Where had she learned this kind of love? A young woman in the front row, who had been skeptical at the start, now had tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying because the music was pretty. She was crying because it felt true. In a world full of auto-tuned pop songs and fake social media personalities, this was raw reality. It was unfiltered. It was messy and beautiful. The girl on stage wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. She had forgotten about the judges, the audience, and the competition. She was pouring her heart out onto the keys. The physical challenges of this section were different. Since the music was quiet, every imperfection would be heard. There was no loud noise to hide a clumsy finger. The girl's touch had to be incredibly precise. She had to press the key down just enough to make the hammer hit the string, but not so hard that the sound banged. She controlled the weight of her arm with the grace of a surgeon. Her fingers danced lightly, barely leaving the surface of the keys before coming down again for the next note, because she couldn't reach the pedals. She had to be creative with her fingers to sustain the sound. She held down notes with her pinky while stretching her thumb to play the melody, creating a harmony that rang out together. It was a difficult stretching exercise that caused her hand to look strained, her tendons standing out against her pale skin. But she never winced. She didn't care about the pain. She only cared about the sound. The music began to climb upward. It started in the deep low notes, and slowly spiraled up toward the high end of the piano. With every step up, the intensity grew. The sadness turned into a kind of desperate longing. The notes became more frequent, weaving a complex web of harmony. The girl's swaying became more pronounced. She leaned into the piano as if trying to get closer to the source of the sound. The room felt heavy. The air was thick with emotion. It felt as if the gravity in the hall had increased. People found it hard to swallow. They were glued to their seats, not wanting to break the connection. Even the technicians in the back of the room, usually bored and checking their equipment, were staring at the stage with their mouths open. The lighting technician, a man who had seen thousands of acts from his booth in the dark, forgot to adjust his lights. He just watched the little monitor screen. Mesmerized by the small figure bathed in the spotlight, the girl approached the highest notes of the piano. These notes are difficult to play because the keys are smaller and the mechanism is more sensitive. It is easy for them to sound harsh or tinny, but she played them with a shimmering clarity that sounded like crystal bells ringing in the distance. She played a sequence of high, trilling runs that sounded like a bird fluttering its wings. It was a sound of hope, a small light breaking through the dark clouds of the slow movement. Suddenly, the mood shifted again. The gentle longing was replaced by a mounting tension. She began to play repeated notes in the bass, a deep, throbbing rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat getting faster and faster. Thump thump. The melody she played with her right hand became agitated. It twisted and turned, jumping up and down the scale. She was building a staircase, note by note. Taking the audience higher and higher, the strict judge in the center leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He knew what was coming. The cadenza. This was the most dangerous part of the piece. It was a solo passage where the performer had to play with total freedom, without the steady beat of the rhythm to guide them. It was the moment where the musicians showed off their true colors. It was the moment where most people fell apart. It required perfect internal timing. If you rushed, you would crash. If you dragged, the music would die. The girl's face tightened again. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a look of iron will. She launched into the cadenza. Her hands became a blur. It was a whirlwind of notes, chaotic and beautiful. She was playing scales and arpeggios at a terrifying speed. Her left hand was leaping across the keyboard in wide jumps, while her right hand was weaving intricate patterns in the high register. It looked impossible. It looked like a magic trick. How could a brain process that much information that fast? How could fingers move that precisely? The sound was overwhelming. It wasn't just loud. It was intense. The piano was singing, screaming, and crying all at the same time. The girl was no longer sitting still. She was bouncing on the bench, using the momentum of her whole body to attack the keys. Her feet were swinging wildly, her head bobbing to the rhythm only she could hear. She was fighting the music, wrestling it into submission. The audience was on the edge of a collective nervous breakdown. They were witnessing something extraordinary, something on the edge of control. It felt like watching a tightrope walker in a windstorm. Every time she played a fast run, the room gasped. They were waiting for the mistake. They were waiting for the slip that would bring her back down to earth, but it never came. She was flawless. She played a series of descending chromatic scales groups of notes, sliding down half step by half step. It created a slippery, sliding sound that added to the tension. Then, she rocketed back up to the top of the keyboard. The contrast between the low, rumbling bass and the sparkling, screaming treble was violent. It was a musical battle between light and dark. The girl's arms were moving so fast they looked like wings. She was sweating profusely now. Her dress was sticking to her back. Her hair was a mess. But she had never looked more powerful. She owned that stage. She owned that piano. She was the master of the universe in that moment. As the cadenza reached its peak, the music exploded. She was playing thunderous chords in both hands, crashing them together in a rhythmic fury. It was the sound of a storm breaking against the rocks. The entire piano was shaking. The bench was shaking. The floor seemed to be shaking. The sound was massive, filling every corner of the hall, pressing against the walls, shaking the dust from the rafters. The girl's face was a mask of pure effort. Her mouth was open slightly, gasping for air. Her eyes were wild, burning with a fierce fire. She gave everything she had. She held nothing back. She didn't save energy